My name is Jaime Berthe, and I'm from New York University. I'm very happy to be here, and I will go ahead and introduce our panelists here. Nathaniel Knight is presenting a paper called What Do We Mean When We Talk About Race? Methodological Reflections on the Theory and Practice of Race in Imperial Russia. Alaina from the University of Michigan will be presenting her paper, The Matter of Race. And our discussant, Aisha Khan from the Anthropology Department at New York University will be sharing her thoughts. And then we'll open up the floor. So why don't we go ahead and start with
Okay, thank you for David and Annie for including me in this wonderful event for papers. And mine came in a little bit late, I realize that. Apologies for that. But this is really kind of an exploratory essay on my part. Really kind of the first time I've engaged this topic with any sort of conceptual depth. So I'm really looking forward to your comments, suggestions about how I might sharpen the analysis, adjust in various ways. I guess partly my starting point is we've all been talking about how this is somewhat of a new discussion in the Russian field, and I guess the starting point is to explore why that is, why this issue is so complicated and so difficult. Can try to highlight some of the key points I address in my papers. Just my starting point is kind of an epistemological problem that I address in the title itself. What do we really mean when we talk about race? And I think with race in particular, there's a danger in using race in an unreflexive sort of way, in an automatic kind of way, as if we know what we mean when we use the term. And when we get into it, we find this proves to be very difficult. And first of all, because of the what we call the sort of disarray of the way in which race has been used. Race is a very fluid term. There's a wide variety of ways that it can come across. And it's very difficult sometimes to pin down exactly which race we're talking about, what kind of race, where. The other point is that it's almost impossible, I find, to fence out the contemporary valence of race, the understandings of race, the baggage of race that comes with it. In some ways, race is a rather toxic term. It has all sorts of stuff that comes with it. And so how can we talk about race from a historical perspective as historians without necessarily bringing this in or controlling the way this is brought in? This is an issue. I talk in the paper about the whole different approaches to dealing with this. One possible approach, of course, is to trace the use of the concept, the Begriffsgeschichte. And we've seen some wonderful examples of this. This paper is very much in dialogue, both with Carl's paper and with Vera's paper, and doing this. But there are problems, because tracing the concept isn't always enough. We find there are a lot of cases where people are acting race, but they're not talking race. They're talking race, and they're not acting race. So the use of the concept, the actual word, doesn't necessarily mean that there's an actual practice of race in place, and vice versa. So we're left with this kind of dilemma. How do we define it? Kind of two choices, neither of them good. You could try to define it inductively, go back and look at how the term was used, and then define what racial means in terms of the context of its own time, which can become almost kind of tautological. Defining race in terms of the context and then reapplying that definition. Or we can use a universalistic approach, just decide on our own what race means and then impose that back into the past. Neither of these work all that well, but you kind of have to choose. What I'm suggesting in my paper is just to put aside the terminology of race and look more at the actual function. What is the theoretical work that race as a concept is performing in a particular area? And there are a few things I move on, one sort of general and one specific. In the general sense, race is one of an array of terms used for social mapping, for making the social reality comprehensible, instilling order, and not just order, but governability, making social space manageable, And in this regard, I think it's a theme throughout the paper that we never can lose sight of the role of power and the context of power in defining issues of race. But there are many ways of social mapping. And so the question is race all ways of social mapping, or is there something particular about race? And this is what brings in the whole issue of biology, or what I call in the paper, bodily distinction. What do we do with this? Because this is something that is traditionally associated with race, but we've been hearing all of these ways that all sorts of other things can become racialized. And in some ways, any kind of essentialistic discourse can be seen in some ways as being race-like or fulfilling similar functions as to race. I would make a plea to keep the biology, keep the body in race, because I think it's an important distinction to make. I mean, when those kinds of discourses are in play that talk about bodies and that embed distinctions in the body, that's a useful observation to make, that distinction is presence. And to say, well, yeah, but there are all these other things that can be used, that seem to function in certain ways, that can be racializing. Well, certainly drawing the parallel is fine, but we also have other languages to use to discuss those sorts of things. I mean, there is a language of ethnicity, and that's a language that actually has kind of dropped off a little bit off the radar screen in some of our discussions. But what's wrong with ethnicity? Why is race a preferable term to talk about these things when we have a conceptual language that works well, or maybe it doesn't talk about it, to look at these sorts of distinctions? So I would kind of, if I have to fall down on this side of inductiveness or universalism, I would fall down on the universalist side and to say that we decide when we talk about race, we're talking about bodily distinctions, biological conceptions of difference, and at least we can be clear about that and have some idea of what it is we're talking about. Other point I make in my paper has to do with depths of penetration of racial discourse, different types of racial discourse. Here I suggested a four-part scheme, which I won't go over in detail because you've read it, but basically straight moving from simply the recognition of physical difference that allow individuals to be recognized, to the creation of group identities based on physical difference, to deterministic discourses in which physical differences start to be seen as the factor determining other aspects of the individual. And then finally to full-fledged racial regimes in which these categories are operationalized into practices of governance and practices of intercommunal relationships. And I think I would hope that this is a useful set of distinctions in terms of talking about how these discourses interact or are integrated into particular contexts. So I hope that will be useful. There's a section in my paper, and don't have too much time to get into it, about Russian specificity and this whole question that we've talked about before. And I'm kind of going out on a little bit of a limb here and pushing back against this notion of Sonderweg, or this notion of exclusivity. Yes, of course, the difference can be overstated, and perhaps I'm guilty of that myself. I think some of the writing I did in the 1990s, when I was first starting to write on ethnography, perhaps does overstate to some degree this difference. On the other hand, if we're doing comparative history, if we can't draw distinctions, and we can't talk about what is particular about a given case, then why are we doing what we're doing? And furthermore, to say that, well, Russia is being treated as if it's abnormal, and so therefore it has to be normalized. Well, this kind of implies that there's a norm out there, and I'm not sure there is. In other words, by suggesting that Russia is being somehow treated in an exclusionary way, are we implying that there's some sort of norm, European norm, that Russia has to be? And actually, I think it's not so much that Russia is on a special path, but every place is on a special path. And part of what we do as comparative scholars, comparative historians, is to try to pluck out those particularities, those details. It gives us something to talk about. So So I might be there. And in the Russian context, just two ideas to throw out very quickly that I think are worth talking about in the Russian context. And one of them is the explanatory power of race in the context of, well, particularly the 19th century. It's not that race wasn't there, but how useful was race in terms of, in the sense of biologically imprinted difference. How useful was race in helping people understand the world around them, inside Russia and internationally? Was it useful in the same kinds of ways? What contexts was it useful in? So the other idea that I kind of explored in my paper, and now I'm intrigued by it, I want to explore it further, is the idea of the shadow of servitude. The way in which legacies of unfreedom set in place patterns of relationships, certain kind of epistemological patterns or spaces that have a great durability and longevity. And I think the American context is particularly relevant, looking at the way the legacy of slavery really set the terms for the American process of social mapping, really up until the present day. What we haven't explored so much is how the legacy of serfdom in Russia sets in place similar patterns and has a similar set of long-standing implications. I just kind of hit on this comparison between the Jim Crow laws and the counter-reforms of Alexander III, and I think there's something there. In the sense, the way that in the absence of an explicit regime of servitude, at a certain point, there's a need to reinforce a regime of difference, one way or another, in a new kind of context that reasserts, reifies these categories rooted in a legacy of servitude. And what this does is it sets in place these axes of difference. But here's where the context with America, of course, varies, and it's illustrated, where in America it becomes race, sort of vertical axis. In Russia, it's Soslovia. And in the sense of hierarchical characteristics or categories of difference enabled by their proximity to power. That's the key thing in Russia. It is privilege enabled by power. And I think that is really a pattern or an axis that has enormous durability through the course of Russian history. There's another section in the paper where I talk about chronology and suggest a new chronology. And I probably won't go into a lot of detail with that, but basically I'm suggesting that race develops earlier in Europe. I'm kind of engaging your adults in that discussion about this, but earlier in Russia and somewhat later in Russia. So in other words, I'm kind of resisting the idea that there's a common chronological framework for the development of racial ideas in European context and Russian context. So I think I'll leave it with that and look forward to your comments and thoughts.
And now,
so the title, The Matter of Race, I really wanted to think very completely about matter, about materials, about what it means to touch certain objects, to be in certain spaces, how sort of actual contacts of people with each other matter to things like how information, how communication works, and then further how our understandings of communication matter. Now, one reason I wanted to talk about matter is, of course, because the state of matter is something that became highly ideological during the Cold War and characterizations of the Soviet Union versus the United States. That both of them were competing to be empires that conquered matter, that conquered space and time, and then finally paved the world with smooth moving sidewalks, that figured out how to make everyone have access to quality goods, that everyone would achieve this universe in which progress and development, right? Which system would do this better? This is one of the axes of Cold War conflict. And in the last years, right, leading up to the 90s, accounts of the decay of the Soviet system started to figure prominently in accounts of what happened there and why did we win and the Soviet side lost. So I've started to go myself, and now I'm going to back into telling a few stories about how I got to this topic and then the conclusion. I started early on to wonder about these discourses when I visited Russia for the first time in the late 80s as a college student, amongst other college students. And I found myself the outlier. I found myself the only one in our group of 200 to actually be charmed by Soviet materiality. Everyone else was complaining about the state of this or the state of that, and I thought the sheets were marvelous. I thought, and I thought that the little plates with the curled up butter, I thought that was so sophisticated, and I thought that the plants everywhere were well maintained, and I thought the people's clothing, to be sure it wasn't Levi's, but in my family we didn't wear Levi's. It was comfortable for me. There was something about Soviet materiality that I found also ingenious. Picking up those sheets again, right? And that I discovered later it's a European thing. It's not necessarily a Soviet or Russian thing, but there's this thing called a duvet cover, which I did not know existed in my family. We didn't have duvets or sheets. We didn't even have napkins. So the whole discovery of then the cloth napkins. I mean, there's so many layers of materials that I didn't. And where I grew up in Nebraska, and I grew up we didn't have napkins. But I get to Russia and there's this clever thing where there's this sheet that has a big hole in it, and then you put inside that. And I didn't know that, and I thought you're supposed to put your feet inside that. And then
You're not alone.
So, but it's so clever. And then the next day the maid showed me how it worked, and I thought, wow, this is great. And so better on me about it. And then I started to think maybe my view of Soviet matter has to do with where I'm coming from, and maybe there are ways that I understand materiality that I'm bringing to interpreting matter. So what does that mean? So, okay, that's moment number one. Moment number two, when I was working in Russia with Roma in the early 90s, they started telling me to start thinking about race. Only they didn't use the word race, they'd talk about black and white. And they would say, you really need to think about how we are like black people in your country. We are like Michael Jackson, we are like Malcolm X, we are like, so they knew these connections, and they were thinking about the circulation of discourse about race, the emancipation, and transferring it to their context. At the same time, I got into a big argument with a Romani ethnographer, a Romani intellectual, when I suggested to her that we think about these contrasts. And she insisted that no, there is no racism here, that's your problem over there. So she was really hostile to thinking about it, and yet other Roma wanted to think about it. And so I started thinking about what's the issue with thinking about it that is such a problem, and how does that have to do with her position as an intellectual and their position as merchant traders, and how they experience their worlds, not just their social worlds, but their material positions too. But then that triangulates with the third moment when I went to spend a year in Prague working for Radio Free Europe, but working with doing the Romani beat. And I realized that in Russia, distinctions among Roma are basically spoken of in material terms. So there are Roma who live in apartments, there are Roma who live in settlements, basically in sort of shacks, there are Roma who live kind of in nice villas with mirrors and paintings. So they talk all the time about who has what kinds of carpets, and who wears skirts, and who has which ways of cleaning their dishes. To them, it's a way of distinguishing amongst kinds of Roma. It's not about Roma versus Russians. Russians also have distinctions about who lives how, but there's just more of a sense of diffusion that wasn't sort of a racially or ethnically, or it wasn't. But in Czech Republic, completely different situation. In Prague, Roma basically live in a ghetto that's near the Seton beer making factory. They're living in apartments that are just bare bones, kind of really bad ghetto conditions, right? So it's much more like thinking about the situation in American cities when you're thinking about how people are separated in Prague. And for them, when they talked about Martin Luther King and Michael Jackson and Malcolm X, they were actually picking up different pieces of that discourse and talking about race in a different way. So they're thinking, but for them, matter mattered, and race mattered differently than matter mattered to Roma in Russia. And they knew that world in a way. They knew about poverty in ways that Czechs didn't. Whereas in Russia, Roma, Russians, everybody kind of knew that things fall apart and that the train station bathrooms are like this. And everybody, there was no sense that certain people are in a ghetto. Okay? And I started thinking about how it is that in the US, there are people who know this, who know the world as a space that's falling apart, and then there are people that we know it, we read about it, but we don't actually have to live in a house where the wind comes through the walls, like my neighbors that live on a piece of land, the plot right over next to my mother's, they're living, it's like the same sort of cardboard walls that you might find in a lot of Russian settlements too, but you don't see that from I-80, you don't know about it, you don't see it. And we don't talk about it, as you were saying right before, we don't talk about that. So there are all these ways that, so those are the stories that led me to thinking about writing this paper. And so instead of summarizing the whole paper, I wanted on the basis of having told you some of these stories to just reiterate the conclusion as crudely as I can. But basically I'm trying to think about how race is also about, we've talked before about how race is also about gender, right? But race also can have effects or affordances on other kinds of realms of politics and experience as well. So in this case, I'm interested in how racialization in the US created distinctions that created segregations, right? And segregation basically means people aren't talking to each other. There's no information passing. And so we were able, my argument is that in the US, we believe we are free. We believe that we achieved modernity, that we didn't have censorship in the same way, the same degree in the Soviet Union. But perhaps, and this is something I'm willing to hypothesize more or less strongly, depending on the evidence that we all collectively come up with, we were able to black box the ways that human infrastructures, human connections, social media in the sense of how we learn things because of who we're connected to. Right? We were able to black box the ways that those kinds of structures afford or limit the movement of information. And we could do this without explicit censorship. You can create a mainstream that can imagine that we have a better life or that we have more and better free speech than our enemies did. We could even acknowledge racism here and there, even as we erase the perceptions that might be being voiced by people who are actually living in separated material worlds, behind prison walls or off the interstate barriers. To put it even more bluntly, what need to censor voices if you can filter them first by segregating spaces, media, and social news? So in the Soviet Union, people didn't, to be sure, there are Roma who lived in forms of what are like segregation, yes. But the thing is that you don't, again, there's not this legacy of racialized incarceration, right, in the same way. So elites were also experiencing incarceration and coming back to try to talk about it and then being told that you couldn't talk about it. So they knew that they had been censored. So then you start talking about how you have been censored, and then the news of having been censored itself becomes news that circulates amongst elites. And then that gets into Radio for Europe, and then we magnify the story of having been censored. In the US, those people who might try to speak about the prison sentence, who are they going to even talk to? I mean, they don't have that. There were already these ladders, these steps in place for elites who have been incarcerated or who have been exiled. There are already structures there then to experience blockage and speak out being censored. So my question is, how do those kinds of structures affect how we come to think of ourselves and then fool ourselves about what the differences are? And then I'm just curious about how that's affecting things like geopolitics.
Thank you so much. Aisha?
Okay, we'll keep the momentum going. First, I'd like to thank Dave and Rainbow for inviting me. I really appreciate being included in conversations about race in other parts of the world that are very far flung from my own area of research in the Atlantic world, specifically the Caribbean. And I also want to thank Nathaniel and Alaina, because I learned a lot from their papers, and I will try to do them justice from the perspective of anthropology with an interdisciplinary bent. The other thing, I have to have two little caveats. I won't call them apologies. One is that because I want to stay within time so we can have discussion, because these papers are very rich and deserve a lot of discussion. I'm going to read my comments, but I will make eye contact. So don't worry, I can do that. To be honest, it's hard to be extempo when the subject matter is not, completely familiar. And that leads to my second little caveat. I really, one of the most exciting things about the conference is bringing all of these folks from different parts of the globe and different disciplines together, because I really actually don't know that much about Russia, although I have dreamed many, many times of having a moment where I can actually, and not just fantasize, take my shoe off and bang it on the table in the classroom and have my little Nikita Khrushchev, ecstasy. I have not yet done that, but I might. And the older I get, the more and less I care about those kinds of misbehaviors. So let me first talk about Nathaniel's paper. And what I'm going to do is try to engage in some of the issues that, again, spoke to me coming from where I'm coming from. And other issues will have spoken to you, but that's what the discussion is supposed to be for. And then I will turn to Alaina's paper, ditto on that. And then I think we can open it up. So let's begin. Oh, and also, if you don't mind, I'm going to just say night and lemon because it's faster and easier. And I hadn't met you when I was writing this, and it felt a little, over-familiar to call you by your first name when we hadn't met. I was raised old school. Maybe you didn't have napkins, but I didn't either, but I also wasn't supposed to talk to people by their first names, invited to. So let me begin. So early in his paper, Knight tells us that, and I'm quoting here, race, rarely is race a product of self-ascription or self-identification. It is rather, he says, a system of ascribed identity imposed through mechanisms of power on multiple levels. He gives us symbolic and discursive as well as military and political, to order social reality and maintain hierarchical structures of inequality. And there's where the quote ends. So this understanding of race is the predominant one, associated with top-down forms of agency, which is sensible given the history of racial formations and practices, certainly in the Americas, which, as many have observed, here today as well, serve the interests of those in power. But the Americas has taught us something else as well, and that is that precisely because race is a reflection of power, it's a key ingredient in self-identity in service of counter-narratives that pose diverse forms of agency and alternatives to structural inequality, or ideal anyway, alternatives. So for example, we see this in critiques of race, pan-regional and more localized, such as the US's and Circum-Caribbean's Black Power movement of the 1970s, whose refrain, "Black is beautiful," was a powerful assertion of race on terms other than those defined by anti-Black racism. We also have another somewhat comparable example from another quarter of the Americas 100 years earlier. In 1885, Haitian anthropologist Antoine Fermin wrote an important and still underappreciated rebuttal to Gobineau's influential essay on the inequality of the human races, which was published about 30 years earlier than Fermin's. And Fermin's tone, the equality of human races, positivist anthropology, sought to discredit the legacy of racism that Fermin saw as not legitimately or necessary to a concept of race. So Fermin's agenda was not to reject the concept of race, but rather to approach it as outside of hierarchy. So as scholars have observed, and for example, Carolyn Fleur-Lauban's very good introduction to the equality of the human races, Fermin viewed so-called positivist anthropology as an objective, science-based means of studying human difference without the bias of structural hierarchies or ranking. So his re-envisioned concept of race was based on a belief that the race concept had potential for asserting racial equality, as well as, for example, reclaiming Pan-African history, such as the Egyptian basis of Greek and Roman cultures, which he thought would provide an optimistic roadmap for the future of the so-called black race, as he termed it. Now, as Knight reminds us, race is certainly, as he puts it, seemingly fixed in the human body, and its characterization through exterior description, that is emphasizing phenotype, which is another way to put it, is perhaps our most obvious evidence of top-down unequal relations of power. But as these two brief examples from the Americas emphasizes, race is also, one might say, characterized by interiority. That is consciousness, self-consciousness, whether in the form of political movements like Black Power, intellectual debate like Fermin's rejoinder to Gobineau, or a host of other important thinkers about race practice, and thus race thinking, who were concerned in one way or another with forms of consciousness or formation of self, whether it's W.E.B. Du Bois's soul, as in the souls of black folk, or Frantz Fanon's, quote, sphere of psychoaffective equilibrium, end quote, that he writes about in The Wretched of the Earth. And for Fanon, the colonized, particularly native intellectuals, as he called them, are torn between two worlds, colonizer and colonized. For Du Bois, these two worlds come in the form of what he called double consciousness, as he puts it, quote, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, end quote. So there is an interest here in looking at the impact of racism in these works, and including with Knight's paper. I agree with Knight that a key challenge of race, as he sees it, is its slipperiness. But this slipperiness also involves bottom-up agency, or at least variegated agencies that are created and expressed as forms of consciousness. Race in the Americas cannot be broached without this key factor. You can't talk about it in this part of the world without thinking in these terms. And it would be fascinating to learn more about how this might work in Russia without the, quote, two worlds and the, quote, two-ness that one ever feels, as Du Bois put it, or the overall, and the overall interiority that is emblematic of race in the New World. Okay? So Knight is interested in addition, as he puts it, the actual functions that race fulfills. He says to do this, he's going to adopt what anthropologists would call an edic approach. However, in anthropology, an edic approach refers to outside analysts' observations and explanations, and traditionally was paired with emic, or the local insider point of view. Now, today this binary is understood in anthropology to be complicated by ambiguities about whether one perspective, from whichever angle, should be privileged, as well as about who are inside and who are outside. So Du Bois and Fanon, among numerous others, would make a good case in point about the ambiguities of being in and out. Now, but Knight shares their interest in race through its impact as racism, I think, because I infer that Knight's actual functions can be thought of in terms of consequences of impact. So rather than asking, was there race in Russia, Knight suggests that we should inquire into the mechanisms in Russia for delineating and structuring social space. But I wonder to myself if these really are different questions. In other words, to find race, we need to be able to recognize it, to know it already. Knight is rightly concerned about the tautology that racial discourse can only be identified if there is a pre-existing concept of what that discourse would look like. In answer to his concern, applying the term race to historical narratives may indeed impute racism to those narratives. But no concept has meaning outside of its past and present. And there is no such thing as neutral meaning or future meaning in exploring race as a concept, at least. So in a sense, we are always retrospective, looking back at consequences. If anything can keep us off the presentist third rail, a focus on consequences can. The same argument has made, by the way, of the New World's, another key trope in New World, and if you could say racial discourse, and that is creolization, which means cultural transformation under unequal relations of power. That's the shorthand definition. So the idea is that you can also argue this about creolization, that it can only be registered with hindsight. As many scholars, including another important Haitian anthropologist, Michel Rolfe-Trudeau, have noted. Finally, and very quickly, Knight does a very nice job of helping us think about not just race as a social construction, but Russia itself as another, and thus another example of the interpolated relationship between race and place, long a staple in anthropology's theoretical pantry. His discussion prompted me to wonder not simply where, but when Russia begins, when the consolidation called Russian culture emerges and congeals, and recongeals. This is not simply about periodization, right? It's about place creating the preset, anticipated negotiations, recognitions of race. I'll try that again. It's about place creating the preset, that is anticipated recognitions of race, that is creating nature out of culture. Or to borrow very loosely from Karen and Barbara Field's notion of racecraft, performing the conjurer's imaginative trick of transforming a place, whether it's nation or empire, into a prefigured, racialized site. So I don't think that Russia emerged out of the racism in the way that the Americas did. But as Knight puts it, a sustained and coherent discourse on race began to crystallize, end quote, I think in part as Russia's imperial peripheries, internal Jewish populations, among others that Knight speaks of, were helping Russia know itself. Now, as Lemon reminds us, race can be signaled without corporeal signs, like those of phenotype. Race can be symbolized by, as she puts it, semiotic material signs from objects and practices, end quote. So for example, and I love this, I want to find a way to cite it somewhere. Meth moms and cat hoarders. I think of myself as the same. I thought those are two great examples of the kind of multiple ways that race can be imputed. So this is an important point that she's making about race and its slipperiness, that the incorporeal can take on the qualities and messages of the corporeal. Symbols stand for each other in order to deliver the same message. Lemon goes on to consider domains that aren't usually considered vulnerable to racialization. One of a number of important points I think Lemon is making is that while we are looking at how, quote, lived divisions of people, things and spaces affect movements of information, unquote, we are asking how people find a language to express their ideas, particularly when marked and divided by placement in space and access to objects. We want to make sure that in asking what kinds of unobvious things block free speech, however, we're not also confirming race in identifying race as habitus. It's being made real, in other words, by repetition of gestures and so on. It's a tricky question how the incorporeal can identify race without confirming it. Lemon goes on to say that, quote, segregation of people can challenge and dampen knowledge without seeming to. So Americans could believe in freedom of speech because social separation did the work that censorship did elsewhere, end quote. But now, at the same time, visibility, or infrastructure, for example, announces certain racialized qualities and also, paradoxically, hides others. So interstate windbreaks and road grading and concrete walls materialize select images and through invisibility foster our imagination of others. I usually hate that kind of honey, but I couldn't resist. This reminded me of former First Lady Barbara Bush's apparently quite genuine conclusion, very sincere conclusion in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina that, quote, so many of the people in the arena, that is that stadium where they took them, so many of the people in the arena here, you know, were underprivileged anyway, so this is working very well for them, end quote. Thus, arguably, lack of information is never silence. Absence has its own resonances. So racism in the US belies our claims to freedom of speech because racism has its own modes of censorship. Classism in the Soviet Union, if I'm understanding correctly, belies their claims to freedom of race, so to speak, because class has its own modes of racialization. For example, Roma, Koreans, Africans, and other various indigenous Siberian peoples. In the Caribbean, the relationship between race and class, modernity and decay, segregation and exposure, share some similarities with these giants to the north and east. I'm wrapping up now because we have a lot to talk about, and I have 10 minutes. I'm still thinking about how the yard or compound that so ubiquitously organizes kin and neighbors in working class West Indian communities both sequesters and channels information, and thus recognition and misrecognition of us and the other. On another note, one might argue that the self-referential irony of which, with which West Indians view themselves through song, storytelling, jokes, etc., and through which they communicate who they are to themselves, is a language, remember we talked earlier about looking for a language for all of this, is a language that can convey information about race, class, and other forms of inequality, specifying groups, but without boundaries of exclusion. It's a very interesting question to think about, I'm quoting Lemon here, domains that are not usually considered vulnerable to racial effects among people not usually viewed as enraced, end quote. Racial effects, that phrasing that's used, that Lemon uses, suggests race as a cause, but it's also, as it were, a consequence of itself. So I think we can think about this further in a way that doesn't have to be the road to tautology that Nathaniel is clearly concerned with. So I don't think I need to reiterate the main points of this, but I would just like to say, again, thanks for really thought-provoking papers.
I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor to anyone who has some questions.
Questions to Nathaniel and also some comments to Aisha's very excellent, very interesting comments. Thank you both very much for excellent papers. My question is, Nathaniel, why do you think we should propose such a rigid distinction between biology and culture, particularly in relation to the 19th century, when our authors see a close connection between theorist of race is precisely in this connection between culture and biology, which they say they cannot properly pinpoint because they don't have sufficient scientific knowledge, but sometimes in the future this connection will be understood. So what's the kind of intellectual added value in this separation of then I agree very much with Aisha that race, even in the Russian case, is not just a kind of category imposed by those in power on the people who don't think themselves in racial terms, but in fact we can say the same in certain instances, or in many instances, in relation to народность and nationalist, who are main characters accounting for civil diversity. But certainly in the early 20th century, we have examples of Marina's paper in fact about that, of people belonging to minority groups using race as a category of self-description in order to empower and create, in a way, groups in which they think they belong. And in addition to the Jewish anthropologist whom Marina spoke, a very prominent example was Kushevsky, who is in the book Ukraine Rus, uses racial theories in order to address his argument that Ukrainians are a separate nation from the Russians, and he thinks that this racial theory gives you a proper scientific evidence, so to claim the existence of the separate Ukrainian nation. So here race is used clearly by the representative of the minority group to empower his own group, and this racial discourse works against the official position of the Tsarist government, which presents Ukrainians as part of one Russian nation. And then this Aisha's comment about how we could look at consequences of the usage of a particular concept to kind of evaluate it. And there is certainly a value of looking at consequences, but it's also a trap if you're trying to do historical research, because you can impose, of course, the later perceptions onto the times when the concept was understood very differently. And in a way, I would say that the concept of race is unusual in terms of how clearly it was in many ways a scientific dead end, and it led to such incredible devastating results in the 30s and 40s. But with many other intellectual concepts, which are very powerful, they lead to multiple outcomes. Yeah? And it's much more difficult in a way to, and not really productive very often, to judge, to kind of have this teleological analysis in a way. Yeah? So looking at the consequences can also muddle the waters when we try to understand what happened in the past.
But looking at outcomes, you could also say it doesn't necessarily have to be a kind of teleological project, right? Because even you said your periodization wasn't intended toward that. So I absolutely understand the presentist trap, as I said, the third rail. But but I think that we can't have a future meaning, because then it's still going to be presentist, right? So anyway, we can continue. You address that, actually. I'll pass the buck.
Okay. Well, say thanks. Well, wonderful comments. I appreciate it, and I know I'm sort of painting with a broad brush in this picture, and so I do understand that there are nuances that partly is and just get these ideas together that need to be refined, and I'm grateful to have them pointed out. The question about power, the direction of power, and these counter discourses. that emerged laying claim to the concept of race. That's very important, and it really makes us think about how we understand power to be, because traditionally we would understand power as being something top-down and associate power with state power. I tend to have a broader understanding of it in terms of power also being discursive and symbolic, and so there are two questions that come to mind. First of all, the power to draw distinctions, the power to create categories. And I sense this sort of draws somewhat from insights in terms of who has the ability to create groups and make these groups stick. That's something to be observed. But yes, the fact that you do have these distinctions does create opportunities for counter discourses, which I would argue are in a sense exercises in power as well, counter-assertions of power, counterclaims to power. So in some ways, I think the context of power is still part of the way in which these terms are created and followed and appropriated. So I think that's very clear, and I think that's sort of addresses somewhat Vera's comment as well, which is very pertinent. And yes, the example of Khrushchevsky is perfect in that sense. Here's someone who's taking this appropriating it and using it for very specific political goals. And remember, as a university professor, speaking from a position of authority, there was, he could say what he had to say because of who he was and where he was, and that's worth keeping in mind. In terms of the distinction between biology and culture, I see the point there. It's a point very well taken. These ideas are mixed. I guess there are things that come to mind. First of all, really, I'm not saying we should talk about biology at all. What I'm really interested in looking at is the notion of determinism. The idea that it's not just that physical attributes or phenotypes are part of a general mix, but when it's elevated above all other features and becomes seen as being the ultimate determinant of all of these other factors. So in other words, there's a causal relationship that's built in. I ran into a French racial scientist in the 1880s saying, well, yes, there's art and there's culture, but race is everything. Or actually some of the language I had in my paper from Carl von Baer, which I put in there very, very consciously as an example of that kind of determinism, where he gives this example about talking about animals and how cows and sheep don't start eating one another, and wolves don't start forming herds and grazing because their digestive system is formed a certain way, and so they don't do it. And similarly, people of these different races, the people of the Mongolian race don't form democracies because their head is formed in a certain way. And when you see language like that, that's a fact. That's worth noting. That's a distinction that I don't want to lose. And so the other point is in Russia, yes, there are discourses of race, but there's a counter-discourse as well, a very strong counter-discourse of nationality and nationalism. And that's a very powerful discourse in terms of shaping the way people perceive the world around them. And I don't want to lose that, the sense, well, we can use this discourse of race, and therefore we're not going to really think about this discourse of the nation.
Just a quick aside on the sheet, because actually I also was very startled by that sheet, coming from a very different direction, coming from a Germanic country where you actually always have two ways, and you have nice little covers with bottom at the end. So when I saw a hole in the middle, I was like, what? Why is that? It makes it actually very cumbersome to put the whatever blanket or you have inside. So just to see that it's all. But I really like your idea about distinction through materiality, and especially the sort of idea of a distinction through the knowledge about this materiality. And just to clarify, I sense that you build up this model essentially on the American case, and then use it to say that actually in Russia or in the Soviet Union it doesn't quite work, but because the fault lines seem to run along different lines than in the American case, where you have more of an overlap in these knowledge communities with sort of racial lines or perceived racial lines. And I sort of want to draw that in with the idea of Mason's Knight idea about looking at race not as a concept but as a mechanism. Because I'm also working on a brilliant, it's very much a knowledge communities. I'm working on the Soviet hippies, and I'm always struck, they come from these privileged families, but by virtue of becoming Soviet hippies, they learn about this whole Soviet underground, about the drugs trade, the criminal element, the mystics, the Islamic Quran smugglers, and so on and so on. And they basically go down to this sort of marginal level. But of course they are mostly ethnic Russian and they're privileged, so it doesn't. But on the other hand, they learn about mechanisms. For example, they end up in the psychiatric hospitals and they see something of Soviet society which nobody else does, and therefore they become a sort of kind of distinctive group. And I think, again, coming back to the Jewish experience, I think if you're Jewish in the Soviet Union, you will learn about certain mechanisms or the framework mechanisms in Soviet society which make you really unique. Other people might know about it, but in the same way how we know about poverty. It's an indirect. So I was just wondering if we do it as two together.
I think in similar ways, I think, I would hear more about what you're saying about how it is they come to know this, and then who they try to tell it to, and where is that manage to, where can they speak and where does it get blocked? I think that's really interesting.
You know, I found it very exciting. This is the first time I saw a paper which also looks at these sort of kind of fluid knowledge currents in late Soviet, or I guess it's like, so this is when it really all starts falling apart. But
I like that idea a lot as well. I think it helps us to ask another question, which is useful, like, where is race in a given society? Because we shouldn't assume that race is sort of evenly spread or that it just is all inclusive. You know, I think you can have pockets of racial discourse, and also that the whole notion of inability to see, inability to see race, where in certain cases it can be painfully evident, and that other people don't see the mechanisms at work. So,
Power works differently.
Okay, so I have a set of questions / comments for Nathaniel and also questions for Alaina. I really don't understand why do we have to discuss race as such a problematic and toxic and controversial term, and to think that ethnicity is a healthier alternative, or nationalist is a better term, or Russianness is something that does not require contextualization, or the same, cautious avoidance of retrospective reading as race. So
false opposition.
It's
False opposition.
Okay, so
Because of functionality, right?
I don't think that this is a false opposition, because these are, on the one level, these are all elements of our practical language, the language that our historical, subjects use. And so whenever we work with this concept, we understand perfectly that, we have to differentiate between how we use them as our analytical concepts, and we also have to ask questions why these people in this particular circumstances, if they articulate something, if they understood groupness, using this particular categories, why they doing this, why they prefer race to nationality, or how they define nationality, that we can't reduce actually this nationality either to biological reading or cultural reading. And in most of the cases, with ethnicity, with Russianness, with Jewishness, with other concepts like that, it's really very difficult to reduce them to one of this, poles, either cultural or body focused. With your example with Bear, I agree, yes, he can be very kind of typically, and a perfect example of this kind of biological determinism, but at the same time, he sponsored expeditions of ethnographer to study languages of these groups of Baltic, small Baltic people who were kind of disappearing, and so it was important to, fix them through studying their languages. So I mean, to him, these two parallel planes, they remained. I think they were important at the same time. So it's really more about analyzing this concept and how they used in the language of particular pretending or experienced by specific groups than singling out race as being really kind of special concept. And I want to reiterate something that I told already, that I think that race is a narrative. And as any other narrative, we have to analyze race as a narrative. And whenever you have, for example, race defined genealogically, even this is someone who speaks about bodies and how race is inherited biologically from one generation to another. And when you have this genealogy, this is already, a historical narrative. So how can you, classify this narrative into biological or cultural? The invention of traditional society, the invention of this concept in the context of British science was a kind of ethnographic and historical exercise, but it was, imbued with this racialized or racial reading of the people who compose this traditional society. So to me, this is, I really don't understand why we have to discuss this very productive issue of how to see race and how to analyze race, preserving this opposition between culture and nature, actually. An old, I think, opposition. So I'm just wondering why do you think this is productive? How does it correspond to your interest in how race is experienced to mechanisms of racialization? And my question for Alaina, I found your research fascinating, and the very idea of materiality as this vehicle for racializing or producing race, amazing, which actually makes me now think about this interesting phenomenon of primitivism in the fascination with primitivism in the early 20th century Russian Empire, when you have all these ethnographers and race scientists, using this concept of primitivism and actually studying material culture as an element of primitivism, but actually talking about a new way to create the idea of nationality based on something which is very much racialized but represented by material objects. But my question is, how would you connect your analysis of the Soviet Cold War period of this materiality of race? So there is no overwhelming kind of discourse on race. There is no agreement in the society where to look for race and whether this is a racial distinction. So people just experience this difference that they may understood in racialized terms. But how would you connect this to what is happening today in Russia with this revival of very often very primitive racism in a ideological formulation? Do you see an option here or some kind of...
It's both, and it depends who you're talking to. I have to, there are a lot of examples. I'll just throw out some examples, I guess. So one is when, I don't actually know any skinheads in Moscow, but I've seen them, and I've traveled the metro with people who feel themselves to be racialized and who are aware of trying to not be seen by people who try to And so that, so there are those encounters with these people who are seen as new day fascists or racists who are activating networks to sort of police this transit structure, right? And there are people who talk about that as an import from Germany. So there's still this sense in which people want to insist that this isn't coming from us, it's coming from somewhere else. And so then not really dealing with it as something that might so there's a way that being able to deny racism still has effects in urban policy and then figuring out what to do about these kind of violence. What do you do about this actual violence, right? So there are blind spots that I think are continuous with needing to keep claiming that we don't have this. Right? And that's one example that I might think of. Another one might be the ways that when images travel back now of how everything's breaking down in the US, it can get folded into sort of, what will be the word? It's not recitement, but sort of, yeah, see, there, it's like a shot of, they're falling apart too, which sort of proves that after all, maybe we didn't lose, and maybe they're discursive materiality and pointing to race relations in Detroit sort of verify a sense of where we should be going. So I think it can come into nationalist discourses right now in Russia. And then conversely, I think in the US, we're still so wedded to our claims that we have democracy, we have freedom of speech, and we're a center from which all things disunity. I mean, I can give 100 examples of that, and I think that the fact that we don't bring these ends together or look at how, hey, we were both actually doing, we were both censoring and racializing and probably contributing to how each other was doing it. Like, the more we avoid talking about that, the more we can keep making certain kinds of crimes. That's where I see it today. Does that make sense?
My question was preempted then by Marina's question, but I'll ask it anyway. And to Nathaniel, I really appreciated your very thoughtful paper about trying to make us think rigorously about these questions and put them in different perspectives. But you mentioned the disconcerting elasticity of race, and yes, it's disconcerting, but I don't feel it's any more or less disconcerting than the elasticity of nation, something you yourself mentioned. And yet, rather than not talk about the nation because it's too elastic, we actually talk all the more about it, or have had for the past 3 decades or so. So, yes, it's disconcerting, but that's a cost to all the more to talk about it, so we can ferret it all out. And, I mean, listening to all the papers and reading the papers today, it seems to me that the history of the concept is really the only way to talk about it.
Those 2 points together, because I think they're related. First of all, I certainly don't want to try to make it seem like there's this good ethnicity and nationality, fine, wonderful thing, and racism. I mean, clearly, both of these terms can be used in very, very harmful and insidious ways, and I certainly didn't want to suggest that because race is toxic, that nationality or ethnicity is somehow clean or green.
There are different epistemologies involved.
And that's right. And I will dig in my heels a little bit about that as well. For 2 points. First of all, I mean, if we suggest that, in a sense, they're both, they're mixed. But even to conceptualize their mix, we have to have the categories in our minds to begin with. So in other words, a conceptual distinction between nature and nurture, or between the innate and the acquired, in a sense, I mean, we can't conceptualize the idea of a combination of these elements without having these notions. And this has been a fundamental building block of Western epistemology, going all the way back to John Locke. And so I don't see any reason. I think by denying ourselves this distinction, in a sense, we're denying ourselves the tools we need to talk about these sorts of things. And, well, the distinction between culture and nature, I think we need to keep that in mind. And I also do think there's a difference in terms of the way that race is imprinted on the individual as an innate quality of the individual, whereas ethnicity tends to be seen as a characteristic that's most realized in groups. Now, I'm sure there are exceptions about this. Oh, okay, well, we can argue about this, but at least as a germ, every stereotype has a germ of truth. Okay, I think there's a germ of truth to that truism. And you all don't agree, but I think there's something to that. And that has different types of consequences in terms of the way the concepts are realized.
Maya? Two terms here, nominalism and determinism. And I struggle here because we keep sort of moving back and forth between sort of actors' categories and their concerns and our methodological concerns and whether one gets in the way of the other. We sometimes seem to be talking about race analysis as if we, the historians, are in danger of falling into a kind of essentializing, and therefore we might want to keep a certain kind of distance from this category because it will mislead us as we pursue our other grander projects. But I think we can give ourselves first of all, I don't see that really going on very much, and I think we all adopt a fairly healthy nominalism about race as we write about it, and then we interrogate and say how far people are trying to use it for essentializing ends. Okay, maybe that's not such a big problem. I don't know, maybe I'm misreading the room in that respect. But the real problem here is that race is that the whole point of race from Kant onward is how you talk about what you're calling here determinism is what Kant calls causality. And the whole problem of race is that you have a series of nominalistic strategies, namely morphological traits understood as a taxonomy, which is unfortunately not causal. Okay, and then another set of strategies which are truly genealogical don't let you talk in these morphological ways. And they're going back and forth. Buffon is more genealogical, but what criterion is he giving you? He's saying that the coherence of the species, of the variety, of the race, stems from its ability to interbreed and nothing more. It doesn't stem from your ability to say, you're black, you're white, therefore, or you're a human, you're an orangutan, and you cannot interbreed. Okay? So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that the ways that biology governs our understanding of determinism, and I mean causality here in Kant's sense, right, is these are states of affairs that are brought about by discussions that are in no way limited to biology. So for constantly coming back to a nature-culture distinction as our problem is to ignore the historicity of the ongoing problem of how we draw these distinctions, which actually is a point you made very well yesterday. The binary may not be nature versus culture, it might be matter versus materiality versus ideality, whatever. But race helps us get at these problems. Okay? Well, there are other things to say, but I don't want to take the floor if there's time later.
Okay, why don't I go ahead and actually take a couple questions, and then the whole panel can respond, because there's a lot of people who want to speak, so. First
And I wanted to raise, well, first of all, these are really very, very interesting papers and very, very interesting comments. And wanted to raise some methodological issues, which partly echo our commentator. So, Nathaniel, in the middle of the paper, you say, this term is so difficult, so let's kind of dispense with it and work from the bottom up and see how understandings of human diversity are expressed, see how they're practiced. But it seems to me at that point, we kind of fall into a methodological naivete. and this is where I think it echoes our point echoes our commentator, because of course you are approaching the study with some preconceived notions. So, you know, on either side of this, you have a very nice, robust, and complex discussion, and then in the middle, it's sort of like, boom, the term gives us so much difficulty, let's just work from the bottom up in our analysis. And, well, again, it seems to me that that just doesn't work as a methodological strategy. And Alaina, your paper is also really, really interesting. But I'm left wondering whether you're sort of measuring incommensurables. I mean, it's really interesting the way you talked about how, you know, what we see and what we don't see in either society. But is it really possible to compare the racialized non-seeing in the United States with censorship in the Soviet Union? Those seem to me kind of incommensurate. So,
And I would argue in more detail that they're not, but I can do that later.
and I just want to say one other sort of anecdotal thing, because you also mentioned the point about driving the interstate, which I found very, very interesting. And it's similar if you drive I-95, but if you take the train, if you take Amtrak from New York to Washington, and better yet, from Trenton to Washington, you go through Trenton and Wilmington, Delaware, and Baltimore, that's where you see America falling apart.
And you see it, and then
You
there's
see
people
it,
who
and
live it.
Yeah.
And then there's
You don't see the
live
living
it,
people
and
because you
that's-
see the abandoned
right.
factories and warehouses, but you don't see them
But the
when you
people who are
drive.
living it aren't riding the train with you.
Too.
And that's part of the network problem.
Well, they may be working the train.
They might be working the train,
And right-
but are they
and that
talking to
way-
you about how they live? Yeah.
There was someone back here, yes.
Yeah, keep going, this is going great. Why don't you continue?
Okay, and you had a question as well. I just want to keep order since they expressed first.
And Jamie?
Yes.
I don't know the order.
You're last, I'm sorry. We'll get to you.
Put me on the bottom.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I do not believe the discussion up till this point about race has been in any way toxic. And I do not believe any of the discussants up there have any intention of substituting the word nationalism for racism. Racism is such an ugly word, so let's call it something else. They're not the same, and I think it's just absurd. I mean, nationalism is not something people can see, while race people can tell. And it's not that someone belonging to a certain race, let's say in Russia, certain type of ethnic group within Russia are more nationalistic or love Russia more than another ethnic group. And the talk of that lady back there, the lady in the end about the Caribbean, is very inspiring because the distinction's strong. And I personally am familiar with the Latinos in this country, and I have recall reading somewhere or hearing somewhere along the line that being Latino is a very colorful thing that I wear on my sleeve, which I have never heard anybody from any other ethnic group uttering, and I cannot imagine anybody from the Soviet Republic or Imperial, whatever, that ever said being Russian is a colorful thing I wear on my sleeve. And correct me if I'm wrong.
One more, maybe, and then we'll open it up to everyone.
So I have a question first for Nathaniel and then for Alaina. So I found very interesting your term, shadows of servitude. And this is one of the ways that you have of distinguishing how race exists in the U.S. and, about the legacy of Russia. And I guess the first point about that is that I think there's a big debate about what is the cause, what is the consequence. Is racism the cause of slavery and servitude, or vice versa? Slavery is the cause of racism, and so on. So it's unclear. But what I want to say is that you say that in Russia, servitude takes a different form. It takes the form of sociology, a state in a sense. And in fact, people in the surface state, peasant state, look like everyone else. So I guess what I want to say is, if you think about the literature of late 18th century, early 19th century, a lot of it in Russia is about the separation of the peasants from the gentry, the nobility. A sense of separation that in the first process, first stage, becomes a kind of romanticization of the peasantry. But then after the emancipation, that romanticization in fact turns to deep disenchantment. And then I think there's a huge amount of reference to the Jordan beauty, in a sense of unenlightened people, but coincidentally, so that sense of this people who are perpetually and so hopelessly unenlightened. So in a sense, creating a kind of a two nations in the Russian situation. So they don't call it race, but there is that sense of unreachable divide. So I wonder if you could comment on it, the shadows of servitude.
That's exactly my point. I mean, you stated it very well. But my other point is that even with this unreachable divide, these same dark peasants can go on stage in a serf theater, dressed up as noblemen and Greek gods and allegorical figures and do whatever and play these roles. In other words, it's precisely because there is this sort of individual, it's such a deep divide. I mean, that's where the shadow comes in a sense, because it doesn't go away and it can't go away, but yet it's expressed in a different way. I mean, is there any equivalent in American slavery to the Russian serf theater, where you have the American, minstrel. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, minstrel shows with whites dressing up as, it's the other way around. Interesting. Is it? Well, but dressing up to depict as well. I mean, I'm curious. I'm not a specialist, so I don't
going to the people. I mean,
Yeah.
the most as far as I know, it's going to be American. One people going to another people, and
maybe a little later in the 20th century when we get full recollection.
And swing.
Yeah, music, but
And dancing.
yeah. Just a brief. Okay.
Sorry, I wanted to ask a question of Alaina also, and then I guess we should go back to Nathaniel. So, your idea of censorship and black boxing, how this happens, again, a comparative between the US and the Soviet Union, and I found it extremely provocative. But I also want to say that your idea of sort of looking for, sort of ideas about self-tactility and communication, media and communication, and how that travels, sort of the conditions of experience that you want to trace through material. That is extremely provocative. Now, the difference between censorship and black boxing is, you said,
They're not the same.
they're not the same. But you say some of these media and communication travel through capillaries of power, and you use that for the Soviet case as well. So I'm just wondering if you make a distinction, I would, if you say censorship and black boxing, that it sounds like a kind of a classic Foucauldian distinction between regimes of discipline and regimes and useful regimes.
Yeah.
But in fact, I think you're talking about diffuse power also in the Soviet case as well. So you're kind of blurring up that distinction between regimes of, because the reason that you need censorship in the Soviet case is in fact because there isn't self-discipline. The discipline has to come externally from the state.
I mean, that's kind of my point. I mean, that people who had something to say were the ones that were not, that had to be disciplined and weren't already channeled out of those conduits where speech would have been possible.
But you also say at the same time that there's kind of a traveling of powers with this sort of capillary channels. It seems like
or at least sort of that the possibilities of reversal works differently is all. Not that they don't work in one and they do in the other, but just that they concatenate differently with how we understand racialized space. So I mean, I'm not saying that, for instance, certain groups. Well, anyway, I can back up, but it's just, yeah.
I'm happy to say
Very short question. From the perspective of comparative history, question race versus ethnicity. So let me ask you this. I don't know the answer to this. We can argue about it. When the Irish crossed the Atlantic and became white in the United States, did they go from being race to race, or ethnic group to race, or race to ethnic? What would you say?
That's a trick question.
Don't answer
Marginalized race to somewhat privileged race? Did they go from being race to ethnic group? I mean, we all in light of your theoretical...
That's a very interesting question. I'm not an expert on immigration, but I mean, it would seem like if you look at the way Irish now, in a sense, they're the sort of banner ethnicity. St. Patrick's Day parade, and everyone wears green, and it's seen as this sort of somewhat superficial layer of belonging that you can adopt for yourself. You can wear on, you can put on your shamrock and go out and drink green beer and like march in the parade and then go back to business. Next time, and that's a lot of the way Americans experience ethnicity as this sort of kind of this decorative function that can be sort of adopted strategically in various ways to signal kind of belonging or sort of genealogy, or even if you're not Irish, you can still wear green. It's okay. So,
in the census in the 19th century.
In the census, I mean, it was a long process to achieve that status, in a sense, to move from this position of being marginalized, and it was a very conscious process. And actually, I was genealogical research, and I have an Irish immigrant ancestor from the 19th century who saw the graveyard, and very interesting, the gravestone they chose, which was two-sided. It was typical gravestone. One side was this very rough-hewn box from like the banks of Galway. The other side was this very finely refined, polished, with the family name written across the front of it, as if to say, this is what we've accomplished, in a generation. To move sort of this, from immigrants to a kind of place.
Sorry, I think you're overreading the gravestone. I think your family probably ran out of money.
No. It was very. That was the design. I think it was done with a purpose. But so it's a long process, and it's a deliberate process. I don't get it. That's
No, please.
I thought of an example too to help illustrate what I meant about the vocabulary reversals. So pretend that I'm the teacher and you're the student, and I've made everybody who is not from New York City has to sit in the back row, and so I'm blah 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 teaching, and I'm a terrible teacher. So you two sitting together, I've made you sit there in the back row, but you can I've created that conduit, right? That you can use that to speak against me because I put you there. But let's say now that we're in a different place that ordered classrooms differently, and I noticed that you two are doing that, and I want to split you up, but I don't say that I'm going to, and I don't say I'm trying to silence you, and I just say, look, from now on, let's sit alphabetical. So then I black box that I split you, because I call it alphabetical, but in fact, I'm creating something that is less alignment by separating black box from censorship. So you turn around and
I wanted to point out that this has actually been a particularly good discussion. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to agree, but it's a good discussion. And I wanted to consider some of the reasons why. And some of it has to do with the way we go about doing our history, the way we go about doing our analysis. So if you, and I'm speaking mainly about history, but I think we would apply to some extent elsewhere as well, in the other disciplines, which is to say that there's one way in which we're entering a new field, a new area. And let's call it the Hoover approach to history, the vacuum cleaner approach to history. And you go in and you suck up all sorts of evidence, right, and it comes into your vacuum bag, and maybe along the way also you suck up some methodologies and terminology, and you put that into the bag as well. And you dump it onto a page, and that's the first stage of scholarship, right? That's one way of doing it. I think it's also a necessary step, and we go through these growing pains. What Nathaniel, I think, is proposing is a different kind of history. It has its problems as well, but it's conducive to the discussion, which is to say that you try to grab hold of what terms we're using in the first place and try to understand them as terms. It's a different kind of analysis. It takes a lot more thought and work. It's riskier because it provokes a conversation, you see. It makes a proposition and has an argument. And I think that's also a necessary part of the discussion about race in particular. It's a race we've not grappled with. I mean, even when we're researching it, we're still trying to grapple with what it might mean, how we might deploy it. I pointed out recently that in the Russian history field, the strongest interventions in the debate on race came from an anthropologist and a German historian, right? It seems to me. And I'm glad for it. Sometimes it takes an outside force. Once the historians get hold of it, one of the ways to go about it is through the terminology. Rigorously look at the terminology. It's one of the necessary parts of the process. In Nathaniel's case, I think that part of what you're trying to say is not that these are the terms in which the debate has been set up, but for heuristic purposes, let's explore what happens when we engage in these terms. Right? And with that qualification, it becomes much more of a tentative statement and the opening for discussion. That's how I took it at least. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I am trying to kind of just parse out what the pieces are, what the elements are, so that we can, begin to have a little bit more of a nuanced discussion about these particular elements. That's not to say that at some point we shouldn't put them back together again. And here I can maybe address Eric's point about the sort of methodological naivete about it. I mean, perhaps if I was, and maybe I didn't make it clear enough in the paper, but just to say, okay, we should just move beyond race and forget about it completely. Okay, but really, I think what I'm saying is we should break down race, have a conversation about the pieces that make it up, and then put it back together again with a more nuanced understanding of what we're working on. So I hope that leaves it a little bit. I'll put that in the next draft.
Yeah, thanks. This is such a great conversation. This was just a small point in relationship to what I think you were saying before, Nathaniel, about comparison. One interesting way to think comparatively, again, with the bondage situations, I think later too, is to compare the kinds of mechanisms of so-called passing that happen within these contexts, which always involve some kind of mix of performance and costuming. So, for instance, if you think of the narrative of William and Alan Craft, one of the most famous ones you had, they escaped by virtue of the fact they were both house slaves. Alan Craft was very white-skinned, morphologically quite white. So they got on a train, she pretended to be a young guy, and he pretended to be her slave, his slave, right? So they escaped. You have a black woman, a slave, pretending to be a young white guy, escaping with her husband, who is pretending to be her slave, who is in fact a slave. You see what I'm saying? That kind of self-consciousness about those morphological signs is crucial. There are much simpler examples. J.D. Green, for instance, escaped he was walking past a bunch of boats, and there were a bunch of slaves carrying stuff in and off the boat, and so he just walked on and hid inside. Why could he get on? Because he was another black guy. He just walked on there, nobody could hide, no problem, right? That's a form of costuming, actually. It's weird. I mean, it's himself. He's actually costuming himself that way. In Russia, you had sometimes similar things with escape, right? Serfs who it would depend. They would get dressed up, for instance, like military captains, or pretend, for instance, to be religious dissidents or whatever. But usually, this was also they added on the capacity to perform verbally in certain ways. So, for instance, one guy who's a merchant, he could pass as a merchant belonging in the Caucasus because he'd done trade in various areas and he knew some of these languages and all the rest of it. So it's just interesting to think about specific kind of repertoire of, costuming, performance, and so forth over time that enables, I mean, again, whether in bondage or not, enables this type of, let's just call it passing, to occur. It's just a suggestion or an idea rather than a question.
Well, like Nathaniel's point, like the much emphasis on biology. So how it sounded to me, not as a call for, once again, let's fall in this old trap of nature and nurture, but in fact, to me it sounded quite promising way in terms of biology and or race or ethnicity or nationality for the matter is always socially constructed thing. And Nathaniel simply, when he once again reestablishes this dilemma, nature, in fact, it reads to me, or it sounds to me as a call to simply invite us to look how these categories, race, ethnicity, and nationality, how they're being socially constructed and reconstructed within specific historical context. And I guess there's also partially answer to your question about Irish immigrants. So I think it's a very interesting, provocative question, but it would be very interesting to see under what conditions and what circumstances they were constructed and reconstructed as a race, as an ethnicity, and as a nationality. I guess that can somehow settle down a little bit this terminological disarray between whether we should use race or ethnicity or replace it with something else. So I guess each and every this category can be and should be probably filled out with this specific context, which also power, power relationship, definitely imperial relations, colonial relations, and so on.
Yeah, I'm interested in untouchability as a race trace. We know that in the South, you don't drink in the fountain, you don't sit next to the person because you might touch them. The Nobel Prize winning Indian at the turn of the century, and remember untouchability as an issue, it's a racial issue, the King of the Dark Chamber, which Tagore, which somehow mixes the color black, certain non-touchingness. And I think the Russians can fall into that. Gorky's the lower depths. That's untouchability. You could always class that people going down losing their, on the ladder of success. I disagree. I think the power of that, in fact, it won the best American college production, and I saw that. They had a ramp, I was below the ramp, so I was below the lower depths. It had that kind of element where these people are beyond the pale. Call it, and the only pale that I know that's untouchability is a racial pale. So I think that's an extreme case, South Africa, I want to mention. If you can get that into the Russian discussion, I think that.
But it's interesting, it strikes me that, Gorky's story, though, in some ways is a story of redemption, a story of overcoming that untouchability. Being in those lower depths, and then falling out of it, and the sort of suggesting that there's an alternative to do that might not have been available in other. It's interesting how it is available in serfdom in cases where the physical untouchability is removed. So you have serfs who become very refined. serfs who become great composers, great musicians, who become quite well educated, become great writers, but yet they can't break out of the state of serfdom. So to think of it, I mean, I think the comparison with untouchability is apt in the sense of a caste, but the technology of marking is different, and I think that's worth capturing.
Peasants, it's a possible, a kind of question and a comment about, I'll mention the French peasantry. In the 19th century and late 19th century, peasants were, not all peasants, but peasants in certain regions were regarded as savages and noble and needing the civilizing mission and so on. And that there was an immediate and apparent analogy to the colonial situation. And the conversation about peasants in France for quite a long time ran in parallel to a conversation about Africa, basically. And then by the middle of the 20th century, people involved in rural development in France often brought with them a colonial experience. So there's a kind of dialogue between rural development both in France and in the colonies. And then when you get to the 1960s and 70s, there's a discourse of internal colonialism in Europe generally, but certainly in France, where regions that are making claims either for autonomy or for resources and so on use the colonial analogy to their discursive advantage. So all of this sort of begs the question as to how the larger imperial context of a society is part of the context within which the urban rural, the peasant elite relationship is laid out. So it kind of begs a question whether in the peasant story after emancipation in Russia, the colonial context is shaping these issues that you're describing in terms of, it may not be racialized in the same extent, but it was implicitly being racialized in France pretty strongly in certain moments. Or it was being seen in the context of a kind of analogy to racial relations in the French context.
I'm going to just piggyback on that because that was part of my question about the work and the extent to which, when we're talking about race, how it can be very productive to also talk about race as a technology of empire. And that can really, I think, open up the Russian situation to a much broader context where these conversations then become comparative in senses that they might not otherwise be. If you're talking about race in terms of the nation and power in terms of national power, then it might seem very Russian specific, but as soon as you start talking about race as an imperial technology, then I think that there becomes a lot of opportunity for comparison across borders and becomes really productive.
It's the same thread, so if I may.
Yes.
If I could bring Berthe one more time back to the fray of the question of the peasants. Berthe keeps writing in a very humorous way about his servant, who was Fadier, who was from Kostroma. Am I stressing it correctly? Kostroma. And then when he sails along the shores of Africa, he looks at the island of Madeira, then the Portuguese colony, and he basically says, oh, it's basically an African Kostroma, right? Which is the idea that both Kostroma and Madeira are subjects of civilizing missions in a sense, right? So I just thought I would add that too.
Do you want to jump on that?
Yeah, just exactly on this point of the colonies. Russia only ever had one overseas colony that it held for a long time, which was Russian America. And the thing that's interesting there is that you see a kind of racialization precisely of the Russian fur traders who went over there as, well, I won't call it racialization, but certainly a sense that these were kind of the dark people, similar to, you know, making the peasants French. And there was a sense that the mixed race Creoles were going to be the ones to bring the civilization. So it's this odd sort of almost reverse kind of situation where instead of using the colonial sort of way of disciplining back on the peasants, there was a sense that the peasants who were in Russian America were just not going to be able to do anything. But their children with their native lives could be educated, could be civilized, could, you know, and then they become this Creole state without a state around there. So it's interesting to think about. The arrow seems to be going in a different way. There's not very much of a valorization. And one of the things I've noticed when I look at racial taxonomies of Russians in the Russian Empire, it's very strange to me when I look through these photographs, and there'll be a picture of, you know, Uzbeks and Kalmyks and Yakuts, and then there's a picture of Russians. You know, if you think it, and they're Russian peasants. I mean, it would be hard to imagine. I mean, the British did very similar things with the peoples of India, but they didn't then have pictures of the English and the Welsh, and you know, maybe they would have pictures of the Irish. I wouldn't put it past them, but there was, you know, there's still something, you know, different.
There was a comment back there.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I just want to, and I think that because we're getting pretty close to time, so we have to go three, right?
Regardless of what the racial component or distinctions are, there's certainly many nations in Russia. It remains an imperium even without the SSRs, inland nations, inland imperium. And it brought to mind what Armenian saying, which is the Russians bear the Tatars a tiger and the Mordvinians a wood grouse. So relating to that, the situational or relational identities that constitute nations, I'm wondering to what degree nature versus nurture bolsters or establishes these more interrelated aspects of it, and what differences there may be pre-Soviet sensibilities, Soviet times, and post-Soviet sensibilities considered now. Putin's claiming you have no heart if you're not moving from the Soviet Union. So perhaps there's even some symbolism helping people to find their racial identity.
That point relates a little bit back to what we talked about earlier about the sort of opportunities that are created by these kinds of categories. If I'm reading you right, and how these categories can be appropriated and used in some ways for you know, for assertion of group identities and drawing of boundaries, and not necessarily in a top-down sort of way. There are very interesting discussions about the whole elimination of the fifth point in the passport, and particularly the Tatars have been very upset by this. And they want it back. You know, they want to be able to claim their identity, and they want it to be validated by the state in a sense. And so I think these, when we talk about the way ethnicity or nationality functions and the kinds of opportunities it provides, I think these are worthy questions, and also to this idea of the sort of consequences of ethnicity or nationality. It's true there are consequences, but as someone brought up yesterday, there are opportunities as well that can be used in a lot of different ways to further the interests in question. About this whole issue of the colonial context and how that fits in, and there's a lot there, and it'll take me a long time to wrap my mind about it in a comprehensive way. A few ideas come in mind, sort of angles. There's the whole internal colonialism notion, based on the idea, and there is a literature beginning to develop about this in the Russian field, but the notion of underdevelopment and exploitation of the peasantry as part of the colonial context, and how, you know, there's a sort of process of extensive versus intensive development that takes place in a sense that keeps the peasants backwards, and that's one possible angle for looking at it. Another angle is the civilizing mission, and this idea of a transformation of project. And this is, of course, you know, all the way through the discourse of the peasantry. There's this completely infused this idea that these people must be raised up, they must be transformed, they must be made into something very different. In fact, there's an urgency about it that actually you don't really see so much in the Russian colonial context, particularly in Central Asia, where there's more of a hands-off kind of attitude, particularly with regard to Islam. This whole approach of ignorирование, that, you know, we don't want to inflame the fires of fanaticism, and therefore we won't try to interfere with the internal workings of Islamic society. We will just govern and keep Islam separate from governance. But with the Russian peasantry, this civilizing mission is really a sort of existential problem. And there's an incredible frustration and angst with the sort of refractory nature of peasant society and impenetrability of the village, and this drives these intellectuals crazy. So I think there's very, very productive parallels to be drawn in ways in which the colonial context helps us to frame questions that allows us to understand the specifically Russian story of Russian peasantry, more nuanced ways.
Oh, I haven't had a question for a while, but I just want to talk. So I was thinking back now, I keep thinking about your question, which, okay, so I probably still disagree that I'm comparing measurables, but I keep thinking of that. I'd like to understand, I'm really curious about what it is that you see to be, because we've been comparing so many things over the last few days, what is it about?
Well, I'm really thinking in methodological terms, how one constructs a historical comparison. You're an anthropologist, and and what is the value of doing comparative work, which I think there is great value to because it points out differences and similarities. But the structures of what you're talking about strike me as so different. That is formal state censorship versus a racial order. I mean, in some ways, if one were thinking of this as if it's a book project, I mean, it's really about seeing and not seeing. And that, I think, is, again, it's incredibly interesting and incredibly valuable. But as one sort of structures a research project about seeing and not seeing, does it make sense to make the key items there two things that are actually quite different? One that is formal state censorship, and the other is the social praxis of race. And, okay, both enable seeing and not seeing, but, they're really quite different, it seems to me. So how does one work that through in a methodologically valid way?
So I guess I'd say is I don't want to compare those two things. What I'm comparing are the mirrored sets of claims that those systems enabled because they were, over this last 20th century, put into active contrast in our diplomatic and our various relations. So on each side of this iron curtain, we were both making a similar claim that connects equality and freedom, but emphasizing a different side of that claim. And so because our systems were different enough and yet similar enough in certain ways, we were able to get away with putting forward one. So on the Soviet side for so long, we could convince, we scholars, lots of people that I talked to when I came back from doing my first research were completely shocked to find that there could be something like racism in the Soviet Union. So this was a very have freedom. So the differences, in fact, in the structures are what enables those weird claims to have had some force for people.
I mean, I guess I would say, but it's a distorted mirror because
It's
they
exactly a
are
distorted
they
mirror,
are so
absolutely.
different. So
It's the distortion
So-
that fascinates me. It is.
I mean, a
It's the
retort.
distortion.
I mean, I can just imagine a book reviewer, coming up with a retort. But still, there was no formal censorship in the United States.
I never
W.E. Du Bois could publish The Souls of Black book in 1901, and Ralph Ellison could publish The Invisible Band.
But it's not the same thing as being able to talk and speak about everyday events in ways that people actually will hear. Nobody in my school ever heard of W.E. Du Bois. Nobody in my high school ever even heard of the riots in Detroit. I had to learn to educate myself after the fact about these people and these things. They are not in high school textbooks. Nobody in Nebraska, even adult, college-age people I know, have ever heard of those people. They don't know about it. It's not spread around. Those conduits don't work. They're broken. So you can say it's published, but it's not disseminated. And so those blockages matter. So we can claim that it's not censored, but it doesn't mean it knows.
Just a tiny suggestion connecting with this. I'm just wondering, there's been a lot done, I'm thinking especially of Edwin Morgan's great book, Americans, Freedom, American Slavery, which basically traces the history of the concept of freedom coming out in Virginia as fundamentally grounded in slavery itself, right? Slavery has to come. So that would be, in order to make this comparison sort of give it more substance, it would be interesting to think of the notion of freedom in the Soviet Union in some way, because there was something then, and then, because it always has, it must be contrasted with some bad other, there must be some, you see what I'm saying? So that would be the thing to do, it seems to me, would be to sort of trace out, and that's vague, there's one thing to be proud of, equality, that's the dominant thing, we already said that, right? But there is some kind of notion of svoboda as well, and to then see what it's,
what is freedom? What is Soviet freedom?
what it's contrasted to internally, especially, right? That would be really intriguing, but that's totally a sort of structural thing. I don't have any substance.
Well, it does come back. Actually, it's imagined. I don't know. Also, I'm very new. But Susan Butmore says yes, that's in mind. She wrote somewhat parallel, but I think she plays a little fast with other people's sources, but she kind of does know. You like how she plays it?
No, I've never read any.
I like it. It's good. I think she does sort of
taking things that I think of as immeasurable and
hanging brings up. She's written on every exact same. Yes, exactly. Also Kate.
I also want to point out that historically there was a moment when the South, in particular the Antebellum South, became a completely closed society. So abolitionist petitions were tabled in Congress. The mails would not carry, the postal service would not carry. Uncle Tom's Cabin was burnt. Effigies of legislatures, southern legislatures actually put bounties on the heads of, William Lloyd Garrison and so on and so forth. So the South was on the eve of the Civil War was very much a totalitarian, thoughtical country in every sense of the term.